Hands-on, feet on, powered on your mark. On is the start of everything. On is the key to learning. Being on an environment, not just in it. Being on the world, not just of it.
Tarquette understands how important on is.
We work on it every day. On the ground with you, designing flooring experiences to grow on, dream on, and get on with it.
Welcome to our session. We have an exciting topic for this presentation, creating spaces to support culturally responsive teaching. How can we better understand the learner to be able to design culturally responsive spaces, and how this can in turn better support our learners? Next slide, please. A few introductions. Today we have with us Dr. Julie Zolan Kramer. She is a learning experience strategist with Wayfind Education, whom we work very closely with. She will be presenting about the educational approach and pedagogy of culturally responsive teaching. We also have Emily Coach, project designer from LPA Texas office, as well as myself, project manager, educational facility planner at LPA Irvine, California office. And the two of us will be presenting, demonstrating through a case study, an example of a culturally responsive project in which Indigenous pedagogy was the forefront of the design. Next slide, please. A few learning objectives. Learn what it means for a physical space to be culturally responsive. What are some of the features of the project that could represent this? Discover the ways in which spaces can be student supportive based on research of adolescent brains. How do we get to know the learner? Recognize strategies to get co-authorship of design from the local community and student population, as well as understanding biophilic design and its importance to health and wellness, a huge topic for this year, including the WELL program for schools. Previously, this program was focused mainly on commercial projects, but in 2018 launched a version for schools, recognizing the importance of well-being, not only for students, but as well as for teachers. Now I'm going to hand it off to Julie. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Hi, my name again is Julie Zolan Kramer, and just a little bit more about myself. I'm an education researcher, and I work at the intersection of innovative pedagogy, learning spaces, and stakeholder empowerment. Currently, I'm working on a research project on learning spaces that support place-conscious education through a case study of Aina-based learning on the islands of Hawaii. So in my presentation, you're going to notice some imagery from Hawaii and some Hawaiian proverbs, or lelo no'ea. And so just also to give you a little sense of where I'm recording from, my home office in San Diego. Geologically, I sit atop the Bay Point geologic formation. Ecologically, I'm within the Pueblo San Diego watershed. And historically, sitting on ancestral lands of the Kumeyaay indigenous people who first engaged with the land for human use and for creating built environments many thousands of years ago. So my talk today will be about innovative pedagogy that we're calling culturally responsive teaching and learning. And so what I'm going to talk with you about briefly is why is that important? What does it mean? And how learning spaces might be designed or redesigned to align with this educational approach. Before we begin, just a little bit about my slide organization. On my slides, you're going to see the main point in the center. There's some details on either side of the main slide for your later reference. And there's also an available PDF, and there's some links there for you to, if you choose to look for more resources. Next slide, please. So the thing is, pretty much any talk that I give, you're going to see this slide, because I want to give you some sense of my theory of action. What I really believe about learning space design is that it is a complex transdisciplinary conversation that you have about the educational approach and how it relates to learning spaces. And it always starts in the same place. It starts with the learner. So as you can see, these are the field buckets I draw water from. Research around built environment, research around brain science, youth development, and the cultural context. And in this case, the instructional shift we're talking about again is culturally responsive approaches. And I also take into account the construct of schooling, the power and politics that are taking place wherever you're going to be designing your school. I think we need to be particularly keen on this in COVID times, where we've seen a disproportional effect, not only on communities, but also on students and their relation to the facilities and how prepared they are to incorporate protocols for COVID safety. So again, my belief is that space design is a cross-disciplinary dive, and the instructional shift is culturally responsive education. Now, of course, in the best case, shifts should emerge from the needs of the learner. And I think in the case of culturally responsive approaches, they truly do. But it doesn't always happen. Sometimes shifts emerge as a competing need within the educational system. Next slide, please. So first, let's talk about how brain science comes into this. I say on the slide here, children are feeling creatures that think versus thinking creatures that feel. What we know about young humans is they're geospatial beings. They're this miracle of sensory structures and chemicals. Now, every day our brain processes, the sensory stimuli from the environment. And our brain seeks to, minimize social threats and maximize opportunities to connect with others within the environment. So the environment really cues our brain, is it for approach or avoidance? And if it's an avoidance situation, then the students start to, it's going to be working within that lower reactive part of their brain. If it's an environment in which they are cued either consciously or unconsciously to approach, then they're able to get up into that more reflective cognitive brain. So why I say this and what's really pertinent to this talk is that there can be lack of cues for personal and cultural relevance within a built environment, either in the classroom or on the campus. And that actually registers within a student. They are noticing everything when they step through the schoolhouse doors, and they can read that, that situation very well. Next slide, please. One of the things I did want to say, I probably moved on from that slide a bit too soon, but that's okay, is I'm going to say one of those links is this book by Zaretta Hammond, and I really want to encourage you, if you want to learn more about culturally responsive teaching, this is a really great place to start. It's called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond, and there's even a chapter that deals loosely with the built environment, really what the environment is within, certainly within the classroom. So I encourage you to take a look at that. In terms of young human beings, let's talk about the fact that when we think of students, they are in their own right a young human. They're not a yet to be formed adult. If we think about the 1990 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which outlines more than 35 rights of the young human, children have the right to their own identity, to their own thoughts, and they have the right to have their culture respected. This again plays very well and aligns very well with culturally responsive teaching and learning. Developmentally, same in this area. What I want to say about this is that it's not really ages and stages that students are going through. We are all, even as adults, working on these different developmental domains. But depending on what age you're in, you might be focusing on one domain more than another. So for example, in middle school, developmental domains that you're focusing on is that of belonging. But that doesn't mean that your developmental competencies around active engagement or assertiveness are not there. You're just updating those. And this, I want to point you to the work of Gil Noem at McLean Hospital and the PAIR program. They are really talking about that. When we're thinking about the built environment, again, we're looking at the student from a cultural standpoint, but we also want to look at them from a developmental standpoint. One of the researchers, Neda Abbasi, talks about the fact that school environments can be very responsive to these crucial developmental tasks, especially during adolescence. Next slide, please. So again, let's get into a little bit about culturally responsive teaching. I'll point you to the link at Brown University. They've got a great resource on this if you want to learn more about the specifics of this pedagogy. And why do we want to understand a pedagogy better? Because research also says that when physical and educational design are aligned, spaces can serve as an essential tool in creating a successful learning environment and in actually improving student outcomes, socio-emotional outcomes, cognitive outcomes, and even academic outcomes. So that's one of the reasons why when we are looking at innovative pedagogies that are deeper, more personalized hands-on learning, we're starting to design these more flexible spaces. In this case, we want to take that same deeper look into culturally responsive teaching, find out what its tenets are, and then try and align those spaces with that. So again, listing on the left-hand side of the slide there, you can see that what we're talking about is an engagement with parents and families, engagement with community, the context of the culture, being student-centered, and taking those lessons and knowing of the culture in the community and trying to bring that into the curriculum and reshape it. So those are the kind of things people are concentrating on and the way in which we can take our environment and design to that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into 10 things that you could consider to ready yourself or ourselves for a culturally responsive space. The first thing is you really need to explore more than just the treetops. Some of you have probably seen the idea of a cultural iceberg, and I would point you to the resource on the Peace Corps website for actually worksheets. You've probably seen in the classroom, teachers are using the cultural iceberg approach, where it's saying culture is more than just what you see. It's more than food and dress and celebrations. Deeper culture are about sort of the unspoken and even unconscious rules that guide behavior and evoke emotion. So culturally responsive design needs to operate from that deeper perspective. We need to look at things like tone of voice, notions of modesty, attitude towards elders, the concept of past and future, and relationships to animals. We also need to look at common cultural behaviors. What is the proximity that people are comfortable with? How do we gather? Can we sit and stand close and far away? What are the ways in which we use nonverbal language? What is our directness and authenticity of expression? These are the kind of things that if you spend the time in a community and try and understand that, then that can be translated into ways in which students then can express themselves into the built environment. And those spaces are going to cue behaviors and expectations. They can both affirm the non-mainstream culture and also signal situational appropriate for the school tasks at hand. Next slide, please. So one thing I also want to bring up that was on the previous slide was that idea of activation. The fact that we can start to explore the student culture, we can explore the family culture, but then we need to really engage our stakeholders. We need to do that piece around activation. Research is quite clear on the benefits of participatory design, both for the participants and for better design outcomes. Participation in design increases ownership and motivation in the learning environment. So we, of course, caution against box ticking and sort of what the research calls pseudo consultation when you're having that authentic engagement with students, family, and community. Be aware that all adults are not necessarily prepared to bring in the student voice. People want to, but sometimes when their own voice hasn't been heard, when an adult's own voice hasn't been heard, it's hard for them to understand how to bring in a student voice. So, as you go out into the community, make sure there's a balance between both the adults and the students. Because what we're really trying to design here is culturally responsive spaces are places that are designed to really create a sense of belonging. Because humans form an attachment to place that contributes to their formation of identity. And you want to design a place that fits the full identity of the student. And what I mean by that is you want a better understanding, yes, of their ethnicity, but also their nationality, their home language, religion, socioeconomic status, their locality. Is it rural, urban, or suburban? The geography of where they are. Cultures that are developed in the desert are quite different from cultures that are developed in the Arctic or on an island. And also, what is the culture's relationship to the construct of schooling? So if I've grown up in a household where I'm first generation, where I would be the first generation college goer, or if I am in a culture and environment where we haven't had those kinds of experiences, that relationship to schooling is different. And then, of course, we want to bring back that idea of brain science, that we're developing places that ask, where are we on the neurological radar of the student? Can they say to themselves that this place matters to me, that I can create something new, that I belong? So these different identities provide a gift of cultural assets in which to influence your design. So for example, if you're in the urban environment, understanding what the street music and the art represents a rich form of critical communication for students, particularly adolescents in that area. Next slide. So let's start now with a few ways in which you can sort of hands-on think about culturally responsive spaces. The first is you really want to utilize authentic cultural shelf space. Align the spaces inside the classroom and outside to incorporate explicit value messaging using native or heritage language, cultural communication preferences such as proverbs, visual displays that are uncluttered and ample and send a verbal and nonverbal message about who and what is valued. Symbols and authentic accents which translate cultural values into objects, in progress displays that refer to student artwork and also to community artwork. Hammond in her work actually has a cautionary tale and says, rather than prepackaged multicultural bulletin board cutouts and standard ethnic hero posters, find authentic cultural elements that add real value. And be careful to examine your space for a cultural mismatch or subtle microaggressions. Well, I'll just give one example in this slide is a space where you can see some green, you can see some brown in that library space and some blue. That's actually drawing on a directionality that's in the Hawaiian Islands. You think it normally in terms of north, south, east, and west in the Hawaiian Islands. You think about being upland, Mauka, and you think of being towards the ocean or Makai. And the center or gathering spot is called a pico, meaning center or navel. And I think the designers in this case use those ways, and everyone in their daily life uses these terms of going upland towards the ocean or being in the center. And so putting that into the design is something that really will resonate with the student when they come into the space. Next slide, please. So cultural responsive pedagogy will also incorporate the unique ways in which history and knowledge is passed from generation to generation in a local context. So your verbal stories, chants, songs, dances, observations, listening, imitations. Those are the kind of things that you want to think about. What are the non-mainstream modes of learning that are taking place within a culture? And usually we can think of this, there might be more tendency toward written learning, there might be more towards oral learning, but being aware of the way that people are teaching, learning, and communicating in the culture is important. Next slide, please. Culturally responsive pedagogy also recognizes the value of community members and elders as part of the extended educational system. Community members impart those stories and special characteristics about important local places and help students learn and apply the cultural worldview of the community. So you want to align spaces designed to welcome the community and accommodate the way in which instruction is traditionally passed from generation to generation. For example, this might include a space for storytelling or an area for demonstrating a local craft. Mainly, you want to make sure as well that spaces include resources that are necessary for these community partnerships and learning. Next slide, please. Culturally responsive pedagogy asserts that the student learning experience cannot solely be contained within the classroom walls. So we want, part of that is to better understand and care for what is around them in terms of the non-human world. So students must become familiar with the natural place around them. And as much as you can incorporate that into the design or bring that into the indoor spaces will help in aligning with the culturally responsive pedagogy. You want students to benefit from the understanding of what's around them, the existing soil compositions, the wind patterns, the trajectory of the sun, water drainage. That's why I, in my introduction, told you what geologic formation I'm at. And as designers, you hold this critical information. You study the wind patterns and the sun patterns. You know the soil competitions. You likely know the geologic formation that this will be put upon, that the site will be put upon. Share that. That's an opportunity to share that with your educators. You can, if you're working with the community or you're working with students, share that understanding as well. Because the more that they know and can take that into their learning environment, the better and more interesting their experience will be. So for example, of course, in California, we would be talking about water. We would be talking about earthquakes. We would be talking about wildfires. We would be talking about the history of the human experience on the land. How do we reflect that in the built design? Next slide, please. So the other thing that culturally responsive pedagogy emphasizes hands-on real-world learning experiences that reflect the history and industry of the local community. So what is going on in terms of human work and life outside the school and how can you make those connections? So we think about that in terms of on-campus maker spaces, career technical education spaces, but also consider connections that bridge and scaffold learning experiences from the school to the community. For example, you might have an on-campus service learning center that prepares for and launches activities within the neighborhood. Or you might have a school hydroponic station to introduce students to the ecological cycle of water, water quality, conservation, and water-related careers. So the main thing is that we want to provide those resources and activities that bridge to the life and work in the community outside the schoolhouse. Next slide, please. Culturally responsive pedagogy also recognizes the importance of a student's at-home language and the healthy development of identity. I mean, this is very important. Researchers highlight the necessity for students to learn this of the skill of code switching between languages. And I'll actually quote this: what students bring has value, and to appreciate their identities and home cultures while preparing them to be successful in the world. So we can incorporate at-home languages in the space design and offer a bridge between out-of-school and academic selves and encourage their ability to navigate effectively across cultures. For example, in the Hawaiian culture, the word rainbow is a nui nui, and it symbolizes more than what we think of when we see a rainbow. It symbolizes the presence of God or chiefs. Many Hawaiian words are about rainbows. So they have words that talk about a rainbow fragment. They talk words about a greenish rainbow, earth clinging rainbows, standing rainbow shafts, rainbows around the sun or moon, words for rainbows, sparkling rain, lunar rainbows, barely visible rainbows. So you can think of just this one example of something that you could bring into the environment, that concept of a rainbow and how rich that is in the surrounding culture, and bring that into your environment, and utilizing the actual home language words that people can resonate with. Next slide, please. And finally, culturally responsive design, well, like any good design, incorporates areas in which you can do contemplative activities, common rituals, such as communal reading, recitation of poetry, listening to songs that uphold cultural values. So building a connection to place means some time away from the directed attention tasks of academic learning. And I know that as designers, you do a great job with your outdoor learning spaces, and there are places within the inside of the building that can also benefit from restorative spaces that help to offset the effects of mental fatigue, encourage relaxation, reflection, and really rest, reduce stress, and facilitate creativity. We want to create places where, as a group, students can come together with their teachers and community to invoke inspiration and belonging. So an example of this is a butterfly garden, which is both for scientific exploration and raising butterflies and everything you can think of that in terms of STEM learning. But it's also a place of reflection and a gathering spot, in this case, for morning chants. So culturally responsive spaces nourish both the mind and the spirit and reflect the beauty found in its unique geographic location. Next slide, please. So I'll just end with this. Designing with the student in mind means understanding what the student's culture and place. Because more than ever, it's something that we need. It's a relational design. It's not easy though. I mean, you really, it is something that is going to take some time and is more complex. But it's something that can make a huge difference in how students feel about the place they enter into when they walk into the schoolhouse doors. So thank you very much. I look forward to moving this discussion on to my colleagues who are going to show you how they worked with the community on the design of their school from a culturally responsive approach perspective.
Thank you, Julie. Next slide, please. Emily and I will be presenting a project we worked on together, El Rancho High School project. This is a 2,500 student campus with a diverse student population. Buildings were mainly built in the 1950s with not much modernization, and it really just didn't look much different than how it looked back then. The community got together and passed a $200 million bond to rebuild the high school. demonstrating, their passion and their dedication to this site. It's a 34-acre site and approximately 245,000 square foot of program space. Next slide, please. As we started the design process, we zoomed out to take a look at the context of the site, located in the city of Pico Rivera, which is approximately 11 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. To the north, we have the San Gabriel Mountains, and to the southwest is the Pacific Ocean. The city is bound between two rivers of the San Gabriel River and the Rio Hondo Channel. This is a one high school district with a very tight-knit community. Next slide, please. The city of Pico Rivera has a very unique history. In the 1700s, when the Native Americans settled in the region, they actually claimed that this is where the world began. They settled there due to like the fertile soils and the promise of good agriculture. In the 1800s, one of the first structures built in the area was a schoolhouse, demonstrating the importance of education to the community. In the 1900s, the two cities of Pico and Rivera joined together, and then the school that they shared between the two cities is essentially El Rancho High School. Therefore, the cities are connected in sort of multiple levels. When we embarked on this project, the district had a vision or a goal that the high school would be second to none, world-class, and insanely great, and they truly believed in this vision. Next slide, please. Zooming in a little bit more, taking a look at the gifts of the site to inform our design process further. The site is located within an urban grid, and it's approximately 25 degrees rotated from this grid. Adjacent to the site is also located adjacent to the city center, which essentially is kind of like the heart of the city. It also has a frontage to the main street, Passons Boulevard. And just as, so we started to kind of take a look at where we can place the buildings and how we can organize the site. We drew from our inspiration from the city being bound by the two rivers. We saw the site could also be organized in this fashion to create the edges of a safe campus. Next slide, please. In the center of the campus would be the outdoor student gathering, student union, essentially the heart of the campus. And the facility would celebrate and foster connection and collaboration, something that their existing campus really lacked due to the organization of the buildings. Next slide, please. Because of the site and the community, it was really important for stakeholder engagement so that many voices could be heard. Ultimately, the stakeholders, through a series of workshops, kind of informed how they wanted the campus to be organized. Next slide. The central quad area is inspired by nature and the two rivers. The concept of alluvial plains came up with the fertile ground and as connected to the city of Pico Rivera. And as water kind of flows through, it carves out different shapes and spaces that start to define organically how students can flow through the campus. So this is kind of how we drew inspiration on how we organized and how we planned out and designed that outdoor space. Next slide, please. The site also looked at ways to engage the community as well as balancing safety. We incorporated a setback towards the front along Passons Boulevard where a walking trail was incorporated for the community to use. We also connecting internally, the site is also connected through a main spine through the quad as well as an athletic spine. Next slide, please. The planting palette was also continuing the concept, starting from the mountainous regions to the chaparral, to the grasslands, all the way to the water regions. Different size gathering spaces were created for students, providing student choice, really empowering students to choose learning spaces that they could identify with or that they felt that they could learn best in. Also, there were moments within the quad space that allowed for student voice to be heard. Next, Emily's going to talk about a little bit about the well and health and wellness and how that sort of influenced our design as well.
Yes, so as Jomei mentioned, this district had very lofty goals. They wanted to be insanely great and second to none. And so they came up with very high expectations for sustainability as well as the health and wellness of their occupants. And so we were targeting WELL Platinum under the WELL for Schools new standard, a pilot program actually. Next slide, please. And under the WELL standard, similar to LEAD, has prerequisites. The WELL standard has preconditions. So in order to be a WELL school, you have to meet these preconditions. And one of them is nature and place. So biophilic design, as we know, is very important, as Julie was talking about, but also this layer of place. Next slide, please. And providing connection to place, celebrating culture, celebrating the local architecture, materials, local artists, integrating art and human delight is required in order to be a WELL school. Next slide, please. We talked to the district about biophilic design and respecting nature and its importance, especially for students, because it can allow attention restoration. Our minds have a very limited capacity to focus on certain tasks, and the ability to see outside and to see nature, even just natural forms, can help replenish our ability to focus and think, and we all know how important that is for students. So this concept palette, which isn't the final finished palette, responded to those biophilic forms, natural patterns, and organic shapes that were our inspiration when pulling materials for this project. Next slide, please. And now Jomei is going to talk about the student engagement that we did and really our process of getting to understand who our students are and what we want our students to know, do, and be.
Like Julie had mentioned, the student voice is just as important as the adult voice in informing our design. One of the key success to this project, we really believe, is that because students were engaged throughout that process and even early on in the design process. Next slide, please. In addition to student groups, obviously we had engagement with all the typical various user groups to make sure that, every voice was heard in the community. Next slide. With the student group, however, what we really wanted to get to was the heart of place-based education and how they are connected to the community they live in. Here are just a couple questions that we asked them and conducted through several activities with the students. We asked them, how do you feel connected to Pico Rivera? And a lot of them answered that, their families had lived there for multi-generations, and some families still had ranches and horses, and there was just so much pride in their history and their community. We also asked them, what motivates you to do well in school? And a lot of the answers came back as family, parents, and as well as teachers. Being a one high school district, the school and family community sort of very much become intertwined. Athletics, as well as back to school nights and those kind of events at the school site, sort of become really key components, since that's sort of when family would come together to celebrate their student, right? And also being one of the only open spaces in the city, the school is also seen as a resource to the greater community. Now, Emily will kind of talk about how this translated to the design of the facility and the space.
So when we first started this project, they asked us how familiar we were with Indigenous pedagogy. And Julie helped us kind of do our due diligence in figuring out what they were really asking us. And what they were really asking us is, do we know who they are? How well do we know the community? How well do we know how ethnic studies matter to them? And what their students say, what's important to their students, that culturally responsive pedagogy that Julie went through earlier. And then again, this additional layer of being a high school, what's important for teens and adolescents. And so all of these 5 elements that we researched kind of went into our design response, which we distilled for ourselves into 5 design elements. Next slide, please.
Emily, let me just jump in there just for a second.
Sure.
On that last slide. One of the things is a lot of schools incorporate culturally responsive approaches, and sometimes they will explicitly call that out. And in this case, these group of educators explicitly called out culturally responsive pedagogy. The students and the educators were very invested in the concept of ethnic studies. And from a historical perspective, Pico Rivera is also the site and has a history of being involved in the farm worker civil rights movement. So those were, again, some of the things that we tried to pay attention to through these 5 design elements.
Yes. And in order to make it easier on ourselves, we named them all with C words. So collaborative, socially engaging, peer learning, action-oriented, and developing the story of self, us, and now. Connected, the community and family related to students' experience, their cultural tradition and values, and place-based. Curious, novel and passionate, inquiry-driven, creative and exploratory, inventive and hands-on. Complex, multifaceted, multisensory, flexible and adaptive, giving students opportunities for choice and varied ways for understanding their story. And critical, student voice and student-led, challenging the system paradigm and empowering agency and self-efficacy. Next slide, please. When we designed the Learning Suite, we really wanted to design for all those 5 C's. So collaboration being the number one thing, the most important thing. We located a kit of parts of 3 different size classrooms around the central collaborative breakout zone. And on the ground floor, that opens up widely into that courtyard space. You can see the 3 different sized classrooms here allow for different grouping sizes, different connections between classrooms. You can see the operable wall between the 2 central classrooms allows for a much larger class or team teaching to happen. And there's also a collaborative professional learning area, staff suite, adjacent to the learning cluster. Next slide, please. Again, collaborative spaces, spaces that encourage both student and staff collaboration. Next slide, please. This is a view of that collaborative area in a learning suite. You can see into that larger classroom with a shared wall between those. Next slide, please. A view of that professional learning area, the staff suite. Next slide, please. And connected. So very important for us to allow for spaces that have the ability for students to connect with their surrounding community. So as you remember on the site design, we had several courtyards, both interior for students connect, as well as a courtyard and plaza on the community edge that highlights that main boulevard of Pico Rivera. And so giving them places to gather and do cultural dances, to have celebrations, and to welcome parents and family to the school. Next slide, please. This is a view of one of the cultural dances that we attended. Next slide. One thing we were researching when we researched the indigenous culture, the Tongva people, is that they believed that that Pico Rivera was the place where the world began. And so we referenced their beliefs and the sky, and this constellation, which they called Sky Coyote, ended up being a very powerful design element. Next slide, please. in our student union space, the main space for students to gather, we had originally looked at more sort of a standard linear lighting layout and then drew from that Sky Coyote constellation inspiration to develop a lighting design based on the constellation in a starry sky. Next slide, please. And spaces for curiosity. Currently, the students use their outdoor space to gather quite a bit. And so, as you remember in our site slide, that was really important for us to recreate these outdoor spaces for them. Next slide. So outside of our science building, which is a really important space for inquiry-driven education, we included lots of breakout spaces and courtyard spaces for them to take their science experiments outside. With that second floor deck, they can do lots of physics-based experiments as well as personal reflection in the smaller courtyards. Next slide. Throughout the site, we included these outdoor breakout rooms to sort of replicate the breakout think tank rooms we had on the interior of the space to move to the outside, taking advantage of the beautiful weather in Pico Rivera. And spaces that are complex, spaces that allow for multisensory, multimodal education and varied ways for students to understand and share their story. Next slide. In each learning suite, it was important for us to vary those size of the classrooms and give a variety of opportunities within the learning suite for multisensory and multimodal instruction and education. Next slide. Instead of a more traditional theater on this campus, we opted instead to develop a very flexible space for them with retractable seating, with repositionable staging equipment so that they could flexibly use this space for a variety of different events and a variety of ways of sharing their stories. And here is a view of that outdoor plaza for the community, right on the edge of that main boulevard in Pico Rivera, and celebration of culture and the arts. And spaces for critical thinking, especially important in high school where students are in adolescence and developing their agency and their own identity. Next slide. This is a view of the Career Center, which is centrally located right off that student union space in the library area, giving students the space for them to come up with their own identity and think critically about their future and their careers after school. Well, thank you very much. And we've included our contact info here. If you have further questions, you can contact us at these addresses.